Good evening. Welcome at the Festival van de Gelijkheid, the Festival of Equality. It seems to have a bit more weight in English, doesn't it? Festival of Equality. For those of you who have never been here, it's 3 days, today, tomorrow and Saturday, 3 days of inspiration and enthusiasm with conversations, documentaries, music, illustration, workshops, panel discussion, poetry and theatre, and a lot more. And atmosphere, of course. It's the 9th time already that the festival is organized. For some of you, it's probably the first time that you're here. Some might have been here before. For me, I think it's the 3rd time that I'm here. And I have to say, it's always a very nice atmosphere and nice vibe. My name is Raf Njotea. I'm a writer and presenter. The tagline of this year's festival is real equality isn't possible if we don't celebrate our differences. And in a way, that's exactly the message, one of the messages that Dipo Faloyin wants to convey. Dipo is a writer and senior editor at Vice. He was born in Chicago, grew up in Lagos, and now lives in London. He published his debut book in 2022, and it's titled, and you all should know this, Africa is Not a Country. It's a deep dive into the skewed perspective of the rest of the world on Africa as a continent and the historical realities that are at the bottom of that. Please give a very warm round of applause for Dipo Faloyin. And while we're at it, give an equally big hand, please, for ANSO, an illustrator, Anne-Sophie, who will be making live illustrations while Dipo and I talk. So, Dipo, thanks so much for being here. I'm honored to have a chat with you.
Thank you so much for having me, and it's great to be in such a wonderful venue, in such an amazing city. This is also probably the comfiest seating arrangement that I've had at a festival, so I can spend hours here. So it really is great to be here. So thank you so much.
Yeah, let's see how long we can make the conversation last.
Yeah.
The book is titled "Africa is Not a Country." I just described it in my own words as a deep dive into the skewed perspective that the rest of the world has on Africa as a continent. How would you describe it?
Yeah, so I would describe it as a personal journey to try and solve a deep frustration that I have. Growing up, when I have tried to sort of speak to people about my own identity and my family are Nigerian, and when I've tried to sort of explain the vast diversity of experience and history and language and food and fashion and culture that exists in this one country of 200 million people in over 500 languages, I've always found it incredibly difficult to do, because when most people around the world think about Africa, they think about one of two things only. They think about either poverty or safari, and very little in between those two things, which is truly bizarre to me, understanding the diversity of our own identity, and then trying to multiply that across the entire continent of 54 countries and 1.4 billion people. And so how this entire region could be reduced to these simple stereotypes has always been something incredibly confusing to me. So I would describe this book as an attempt to try and sort of unpack where those stereotypes have come from, to break them, and then hopefully to introduce people to the reality that I know.
Yeah, you mentioned the deep frustration underlying all that, and you really feel that as a reader. As I read the book, I mean, you felt that there was a frustration about the way Africa and African countries are portrayed in the media, in popular culture. Was there like a certain specific moment in time, or something that occurred to you that made you say, okay, I've had enough. Let me just get behind my computer and write this down?
The idea is something that's been in me for, since I was a teenager in particular, because, as I said, I grew up in Lagos, and I then went to boarding school in the UK when I was 12. And I love Lagos. It's our hometown, and I was incredibly excited to kind of go. I went to boarding school in the UK, in a city called Bath, and I was so excited to kind of go there and tell people about, you know, our wonderful city and introduce them to our history and our culture. But then I just kept getting questions about, like, you know, do you have elephants as pets and things like that, and what are there snakes everywhere, and you know, have you ever seen a giraffe? And this is like I come from a bustling metropolitan city. You know, I've never seen a wild animal in my life up until that point, and it was something that, and so that frustration was there. It's like, oh, you have to. It feels like you first have to kind of break those stereotypes first before you can then start to really introduce people to the reality that you knew, and that's something that has sort of followed me, you know, well into my adult life. And then sort of came the summer of 2020 when, you know, the Black Lives Matter movement was spreading around the world, and the world was having these conversations about race and identity and history. And I sort of, at that point, felt like Africa certainly has to be a part of this conversation. You know, when we talk about history and colonialism, when we talk about, you know, where a lot of these sort of racist ideas came from, you know, it came from the way in which the Western world has long treated Africa, and it just felt like you can't have an honest discussion about these things without including Africa in that conversation. And so up until that point, I had assumed that someone else would write the book. And then it kind of felt like, oh, you know, this would be a really good time to write this book, or someone to write this book. And then it kind of felt like no one's doing this, so I'll try. And to my shock, it sort of happened.
You did.
Yeah.
Can you tell us a little bit more about, you know, your life, just very briefly, because you mentioned, you know, you grew up in Lagos and then went to the UK, but you were born in Chicago. It also, you know, states it says in the book. Yeah. How did that happen?
Yeah. So my dad was in the air. He's retired, but he was in the Air Force, the Nigerian Air Force, and you know, he'd been posted out to the US, and I was born in Chicago, and then we moved back to Lagos when I was sort of like 4 years old, and then stayed in Lagos until I then went to boarding school when I was 12. But my parents stayed in Lagos, and a lot of my family are in Lagos, but I've got family in the UK, I've got family around Europe, I've got family in the US. And so I always grew up with this understanding that our individual identities are very complicated. They involve so many decisions that we make, decisions that others have made for us, you know, before we were even born. And it's always been something that I've always been excited that we all come, when you meet someone, you know, I've always wanted to kind of learn about all the many things that make them who they are, and all the, you know, both the geographical locations that they've lived in, and all the influences that have grown each individual person. And so that's something that I've always been personally fascinated by, and to be fascinated by these things, and then to see your own identity and your own culture and people and countries around you to be stripped of that appreciation for their unique identity, to be stripped of any curiosity about all the many complicated things that build up an individual's identity, let alone the identity of an entire community or an entire country. And so that, for me, is where a lot of that frustration came from, and it's why I sort of start the book with my own identity and talking about all the sort of many dynamics at play when it comes to making up who I am and who my family are, expanding that to Lagos, and then beyond that, then saying to people, you know, understanding the importance of a complex identity is not only something that we should afford people as an act of generosity, but throughout history, often when we've wanted to denigrate communities, when we've wanted to subjugate them, and in many cases when people have attempted to entirely eradicate groups of people, the first thing they do is they strip them of their humanity. They strip them of their specific identity. And they create these stereotypes that are meant to make it easier for you not to see them as human beings. And so that's why it is, you know, I start the book talking about that, and why it's so important. Not just, I think, you know, on a fun cultural level, people are missing out, getting to experience a lot of, you know, the music and food and so many wonderful things that exist across the continent, but also as a simple matter of decency, and a matter of people's safety and security. It's important that wherever we find it, we never allow people to be stripped of their unique identities. And that is something that we should all be wary of.
Yeah, and talking about identities, I mean, how would you describe your own identity, you know, as a complex identity?
Yeah, it's a very good question. I mean, I see myself first and foremost as Nigerian, but this sort of you go to Nigeria and then you see a lot of the British influences on you. When I'm in UK, I see a lot of Nigerian influences on me. You go to the US and you kind of see that, you know, with having family there and spending time there's a lot of that. So I very much sort of see myself as sort of Nigerian, British, Nigerian, American, lots of different things. But that core sort of identity of who we are and you know, my family and all that, I think has always been something that's been really important to me. But I enjoy that sort of flexibility. I enjoy talking to people about all the many different things that make up, you know, who I am, and then I want that offered to, you know, literally over 1 billion people across this continent.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, my own father is Nigerian, Igbo, and I mean, I grew up in Belgium. We just went to Nigeria once when I was 11 years old, so that's quite a different story than yours. And I do remember Lagos from that time. We spent a few days there, and you describe it as in the beginning of the book, and you just mentioned as well that, I mean, it's a huge metropolis, like really big and a bustling city. And you say you describe it as the punchline to a joke that could start with 21 million people unburdened by self-doubt walk into a bar. And that the point is, I mean, there are a lot of people in Lagos, none of them are shy. It's an interesting way of putting it. And frankly, to me, I mean, sounds like a nightmare to someone introverted like myself. Like, everyone's just very confident, no one's shy. Is that really how it is?
Yeah, it certainly feels that way. It's such a unique, vibrant city. It's a city that feels like it's sort of making it up as it goes along. There's no real plan. It's really run off of just confidence and vibes. And, you know, these huge personalities that exist in all walks of life and across all, you know, economic groups as well. And so that's what makes it just such a really, really unique, fascinating city. And I think being from somewhere like that has always made it seem even crazier to me, that people can reduce this entire continent to these simple stereotypes. You know, when Lagos itself isn't one thing. You know, it's thousands of different things in this one city. It's different things every day and every year. You know, you just drive around and you just see people living in so many different ways, and it is this microcosm of experience and life. And the vibrancy of a young city as well. And maybe we'll talk about it a bit later on as well, but, you know, these are incredibly young countries as independent nations. You know, my parents are older than an independent Nigeria. And so when you're in these cities, you see that vibrancy of people trying to build not only a city, but an identity. And you see that at play at work, and people have done such an incredible job, and that is something that I want people to see and really appreciate, and understand and engage with on a human level.
Yeah, and it's, I mean, these kinds of stereotypes, and the ones that you mentioned, you know, while studying in the UK, or while living in the UK, you know, that people assume, you know, you've seen a wild animal or whatever. It's, they don't do justice, obviously, to what the experience really is. And one of the things, I mean, you start your book with another sort of cool stereotype, I thought. The very beginning of the book is like a proverb, or a would-be proverb maybe, where you say, insert generic African proverb here, ideally an allegory about a wise monkey and his interaction with a tree, or the relationship between the donkey and the ant that surprisingly speaks to grand gestures of valor, and sign it off with ancient African proverb. I mean, where did that come from?
Yeah, I mean, you see people kind of just talk about, you know, this is an African proverb, and it's that lack of specificity that you know that can be very, very frustrating. There are some cultures, my family, where Yoruba, and Yoruba culture has plenty of sayings and proverbs, and you know, but I can't speak for every single ethnic group across the whole continent. There'll be some that, you know, proverbs is not part of their tradition, but yet, you know, it's that sort of laziness of of thought and process, whereby people simply see something and they're happy to just label it African in a way that you don't label, this European saying. For example, you wouldn't do that. You would give credit and appreciation to the individuals who have, who have actually created that saying. And it speaks, and when you kind of break down a lot of these, when you learn about proverbs and how they're connected to specific ethnic groups, it often tells you a lot about their history and speaks to who they are. And that's another example of kind of stripping that specificity away from them, taking away that credit of thought and wisdom and knowledge and experience away from that individual group and saying, it's simply just an African proverb. And the ones that interested people the most seem to just involve wise animals. And it's that sort of constant connection between just us and animals. And Safari is great, by the way. I'm not saying don't engage with Safari. There are plenty of incredible safaris across there, but there's other things that exist there as well.
And is it that laziness that you refer to when you say at the end of the book, like that Africa has always been treated more as an idea than an actual place?
Yeah, it's sort of treated as this thought. For some people, it's kind of this experiment. This is a place that you send $1 a month or something, and then you just see what happens. See how these people sort of manage, and often they're sort of degraded in this way, and that is something that has been has had a hugely negative impact on the people. The people haven't looked to engage with the continent in the way in which it actually exists, but instead they engage with this sort of single idea of the continent that's been allowed to survive for decades and decades. And that has been at a loss, really, not only to the continent, but also to the rest of the world. There's so many wonderful things that people should be engaging with, but instead that has been replaced with this just idea of the region. People are very happy and content with the idea that they have in their minds, and they don't really, there isn't a huge amount of energy to go in there and try and discover all the many things that exist.
And it's maybe also, a good excuse for people to feel good about themselves. You mentioned this idea of, sending $1 a month, and you tackle the concept of white saviorism in one of the chapters in the book. Very obvious examples of that white saviorism are, the famous charity songs that you reference, "We Are the World," "Do They Know It's Christmas?" Why are initiatives and imagery like that specifically harmful?
Yeah, so it's something that we often sort of first engage with other cultures outside of our own through the media, whether it's through popular culture or it's through the news, or in Africa's case, most people's impressions of the continent have come from these charity campaigns. They found the first sort of really successful one was in the 80s, which was Band-Aid's "Do They Know It's Christmas?", which is a song that was meant to be in response to a famine that was going on in Ethiopia, but it makes no mention of Ethiopia at any point in the song. Instead, it describes Africa as a land of dread and fear, where there's no running water, and the only hope that Africans have every year is to stay alive. And this is a song that spoke of Africa in just the most dismal, sad, depressing terms, but then it put a bunch of pop stars on it, and it's sort of a nice little jingle, and it became this incredibly popular Christmas song that sort of played in the background. It's in shopping centers and at parties, very strangely, and you have this idea just so easily just hitting around people's minds of this place of just turmoil and suffering and pain, and one single dystopian destiny that exists across this continent. And it spread around the world. It raised a lot of money, and it inspired a lot of copycat campaigns to do the same thing. And so you had decades and decades of this imagery and these words being used to describe Africa, and that's how the rest of the world was getting to know the continent through this single story of pain and strife and nothing else. And the harm it did is that it created this sort of barrier between. In Do They Know It's Christmas, there is a line that literally says, thank God it's them instead of you, and pray for the other ones. And it othered Africa. It turned it into them and us, those people over there who are suffering and can't look after themselves. And that's was replicated throughout the 80s and the 90s and into the 2000s as well. You had a similar thing happen with there was the campaign Kony 2012. Don't know those of you who remember Kony 2012 in the audience, but that was a campaign that depicted Uganda in these incredibly dark ways, and it was the video that was released was grossly inaccurate, and it had a hugely negative impact on the country. In the year before the film came out, Uganda had been picked by Lonely Planet as one of the top tourist destinations in the world. Tourism, as you can imagine, completely plummeted after this video that became, YouTube's most watched film within a week, started to spread around the world. You might send $1 to a country if you watch a film like that, but you're not going to want to go on holiday there. When all you see is darkness and pain and suffering, you're not going to want to move your family there or start a business there or do all the things that you do when you are curious or interested in the culture of a country. Instead, that feeling of curiosity and excitement towards this entire region is replaced with pity. And these countries didn't want pity. They had fought for their independence, and they had done the hard work that comes with building a country. And it's not to say that there weren't challenges. There certainly were challenges in these countries. They are like anywhere else where they have stories of great triumph and success, but also, of course, there are stories of suffering and pain. But in a lot of the ways in which these countries wanted to establish themselves was to get the rest of the world to engage with them on an individual level as they were. And that, as you can imagine, was an incredibly difficult thing to do when all the rest of the world was seeing images of suffering and pain and nothing else.
Yeah, and one of the problems, of course, or the biggest problem, is that these images work, so to speak, for a broad Western audience. The images of destitute African children, of ruthless rebel leaders, becoming a threat to populations. I mean, yeah, what if they work? Like, how can we educate Western audiences away from that imagery?
Yeah, I think the first thing is to really show how inaccurate a lot of that imagery is, and how it painted a picture often that left a lot of context out of the conversation. That didn't speak to the individuality of the particular crisis necessarily. That there was certainly a famine in Ethiopia, but understanding why there happened to be a famine, understanding the political dynamics at play, that was what should have been done. But without that, you had a lot of the government of the time were able, in fact, to take advantage of the money that was suddenly coming into their country, and it didn't really work to help the local people. So understanding the political dynamics at play would have then said, oh, here is what's going on in Ethiopia, here's why this group is hoarding this grain. Okay, let's come up with a political response that could maybe put pressure on the government. That was replaced with all of Africa is dark and dangerous and suffering, and these people have no hope, and they can barely lift their own heads up to survive. Go and save them. And this has been the message of the continent right back to 1884 and the Berlin Conference, when the scramble for Africa began and the colonialists met, and they had, and the biggest problem, or one of the biggest problems they had, was that it was illegal to just go in and colonize the region. And so they came up with this myth that they would spread around the world, and they would say that Africans are savages and they can't look after themselves and they're uncivilized, and so therefore they need us to come in and save them. They need us to bring what they call the 3 C's, which was commerce, Christianity, and civilization, to these uncivilized people. And of course, that was all a lie. It was just a justification to get away with the colonial era that would then follow that. But right from 1884 up until the modern era, you had this same stereotypes, this same idea that Africans are just helpless, hungry people who offer very little to themselves and certainly don't offer anything to the rest of the world. And so therefore they're only good to be saved. And that has been, a really, really destructive thing for the continent.
Do you have the idea that, NGOs or aid organizations realize now how much damage campaigns have done in the past, and that they're trying to change, or that they're deciding to leave even? Is there a change going on?
Not enough of a change at the moment. I think that the change seems sort of very limited at the moment. I don't think there's sort of been a full reckoning for just all that happened in the 80s and the 90s, especially in the early 2000s, and how damaging and how the images that we see, not only the impact that it had in charity campaigns, but also in popular culture as well, in films, in how it just just how destructive those images were. I don't think there's kind of been that full reckoning yet, and I think that it's really, really important for that to happen. And as I say in the book, I think charities and development agencies and NGOs, I think they are full of wonderful people who genuinely want to help and do good. And the problem with a single story is that it creates mechanisms that can be dangerous instead, without people realizing it. The stereotypes, the stories we tell ourselves and we pass on from generation to generation. It's what you lean on when you then make a decision to try and do good. And so that is what needs breaking first. And then when you do that and you realize that, you then go, okay, what other mechanisms are there that can replace that? But that is the danger of stereotypes and single stories, is that good people too easily believe them. You grow up with those ideas, and then they become the mechanism by which you actually try and seek change, and that can often kind of cause even more problems.
And talking about these stereotypes and stereotypical stories, there is, if you allow me, I'd like to read an excerpt of the book, the beginning of the 5th chapter, I think, which is about you give suggestions on how to pitch a Hollywood script or a Hollywood film about Africa, and you give 5 concepts, and you can pick one. You just have to pick 1 out of 5. So the first one is generic, exotic African savanna as the background to young colonial love that somehow inspires a young village boy to learn to read. Second one is a rich New Yorker with no time for love is forced to leave her high-powered job. She's convinced to get away from it all by going on safari in Africa, where the lavish city lifestyle to which she has become accustomed is replaced by the rudiments of basic village life. There she meets and eventually falls for the only other white person there, a fellow American who's been living among Africans for decades and has thus earned the respect of the locals. Adjusting to African life is a struggle at first, but with the help of an entire village that has nothing better to do, the New Yorker discovers a part of herself she never knew existed. She gives back by teaching a young village boy how to read, or by saving a tiger cub from poachers. The third one is a young village child, against the odds, learns to read to save his impoverished village. The young boy learns at night using a makeshift light fashioned out of wire and tenacity. The fourth one, a coming-of-age story about a young man trying to balance his ambitions with what his ancestors expect of him. His ability to read is up in the air. And then the fifth one, a thriller about an unfolding genocide that threatens to destroy multiple villages until a white man intercedes. Sadly, the situation is too grave for anyone to learn to read, but that all changes when the white man agrees to adopt a former child soldier orphaned by the war, and they return together to Cleveland, where the child learns to read so he can address the United Nations about the plight of his country. I just wanted to share that with the audience because it really made me laugh out loud. It's so ridiculous, and yet we all sort of recognize this imagery. I mean, there's a, or to me as a screenwriter, even that hits close to home because you deal with stereotypes and you try to think about how to represent people and your characters. What would you say is, I mean, it's a lazy question maybe even, but what is a good representation for a character of an African country, for example?
Yeah, so for me, it's accepting that our lives are as varied and fun and silly as anywhere else. I kind of feel like we would have really made it when we, just a simple, mundane, two friends go on a road trip over the summer sort of film gets made about, about someone from an African country, or just a nice sort of fun coming of age college film about some kids, hitting maturity and trying to figure out the world around them. A nice fun. Anything that's just about day-to-day basic life, and the issue is that a lot of people struggle to even picture just day-to-day basic life. People getting up, going to work, nothing is chasing them. There's nothing but just the day-to-day mundanities of trying to make it and not only survive. Everything is kind of seems to be about sort of survival, as if every morning we kind of wake up not knowing whether we'll make it through the day, and yet most people are just as happening everywhere else in the world, having very, very silly daily battles with life and friendship and love. And exciting business ventures that some succeed, some fail. People are going on trips. You're still just battling the day-to-day normalities of life, and that is, and that's what film industries within the continent do so well. It's what Nollywood does incredibly well. It really represents just day-to-day life, and people going about their business, and there's a lot of humor and you can kind of watch it and really recognize. It's particularly popular amongst sort of my parents' generation, so it may be sort of a bit more representative of their lives. But that is kind of what you want to see across pop culture around the world. And when that happens, I think that when we realize that, we haven't really done that for decades and decades, then suddenly it's like, there must be so many incredible stories that haven't been told across this vast region, and hopefully that then inspires people to then want to go and read about all the incredible stories that exist. All the when you've got a country like Nigeria alone with over 500 languages, and you just imagine all the many communities, and then you imagine spreading that across the continent, all the different traditions and histories, all of that can be put into a song or into a book or into a film. Or a TV series or whatever it might be, it feels like when that appreciation that we are just normal people going about our normal lives, when that is fully appreciated, then I think that so many wonderful stories will be told through that.
Yeah, and it's always balancing, or at least for me, if I want to write something about a character of color in this sort of setting in Belgium, it's always the question for me, like, do I portray them to be just like the rest, or do I focus on what makes them different? Because maybe I will, erase their authenticity or their, who makes them. Like it's always this balance, but it's not an easy answer, I suppose. Yeah.
I don't know whether we're meant to acknowledge what's going on, but that's very good. By the way.
Yes,
really good.
Yes, we can definitely acknowledge it. ANSO, you're being
that's very good.
Applauded. Thanks so much. It's amazing.
Very good.
Let's talk a little bit about history, shall we? You mentioned it before. We can't talk about African countries without acknowledging the history of colonialism. And the political reality of African countries is almost entirely a consequence of that colonialism. And what's most often cited, I think, is the Berlin Conference of 1884. What happened and how did that shape Africa or the geography of Africa as we know it today?
Yeah, so it's this single most important event that's happened to what I sort of consider modern Africa, which is sort of everything that occurred from 1884 right up until today. And it was essentially the creation of the countries that we know today. So you had the great colonial powers of the day, Great Britain, Belgium, France, Germany, Italy, the United States were there. And they all gathered to discuss the continent. They had sent, prior to this meeting, explorers into the region. And those explorers had come back and said, this is an incredible land full of incredible people with incredible natural resources, communities that have these unbelievable artifacts that are as wonderful as anything else around the world. And so, of course, as we know, the colonialists heard this and decided that they wanted to go in there and take this land for themselves and certainly these artifacts for themselves. And the key, or one of the, they wanted to meet essentially to hash out exactly how they were going to do it, because they were afraid that they were going to go to war with each other if they all simply just ran in there. And Great Britain and France wanted a piece of land. They didn't want to go to war with each other. They didn't care about the lives of the millions and millions of people who actually lived on the continent. They didn't invite any representatives from the continent to this meeting. But what they wanted to do is they wanted to come up with a basic system and a basic set of rules that they could they'd all agree to adhere to, so that they wouldn't go to war with each other. And so that was the point of this meeting. They didn't actually carve up the continent at the Berlin Conference. It was just basically to set the rules, and they came up with the rule of some principles of occupation, which essentially meant that you had to be the first one to reach a piece of land, plant your flag, and then force the local population under your will by however means necessary. And so that was that moment there created this scramble for the continent. And I think scramble is a really good word because it speaks to this rush and this panic and this motivation to simply just grab and take whatever you can as quickly as possible. And that created essentially really, on a geographical level, terrible countries. These countries don't make any sense. They are often way too big. In Britain's case, they often tried to fill these countries with forcibly fill them with as many different languages as possible, to make it hard for the communities to be able to communicate with each other so they could fight back against the colonialists. But on top of that, they implemented these divide and rule policies so what the British would do is that they would then go and find the most unscrupulous people, the worst people amongst us, those who were quick to accept a bribe with no morals. They would empower them, enrich them, train them militarily, and then put them in charge of these communities, and you'd incentivize them to turn on individual communities and to turn communities against each other. And what this created was just this whirlwind of chaos and violence introduced into a continent that previously was free, built communities, you had large kingdoms, you had smaller nomadic groups, and everything that exists in between that, building and creating and growing naturally and organically. And suddenly the colonialists came in, introduced violence and chaos and division, and created countries that were essentially made to fail. These countries weren't even necessarily countries, they were more like business deals in order to extract as much natural resources as possible. And when you understand that, then you start to see that these African countries, what they inherited in independence was a terrible deal. They inherited countries that they didn't want, countries that were meant to fail, countries that were never meant to succeed or even, exist for any longer period of time than the colonialists needed to take and extract land from them. And you start to kind of see the picture differently. You think to yourself, actually, in the space of just 60 years, these countries have done an incredible job with what they've inherited, considering that they inherited a house built on sand, to sort of shore it all up, to create new identities, to come together despite those differences, to come up with a national anthem, national traditions, and to contribute in so many different ways. That narrative starts to shift in your mind. But without that context, if you don't learn about colonialism, you don't learn about, most other, I'm sure it's probably different, I don't know as much here, but, around the world they've never heard of, the Congo Free State and King Leopold II and all that happened, the foundations of how the Democratic Republic of Congo came about. When you don't know all of that, and you don't know how fragile these countries were deliberately created to be, then it's easy to think that something is deliberately wrong with Africans, something is strange about Africans. Why is it that these African countries went through these difficult periods? You start to blame the local population. You start to think, there must be something wrong with them. And when you don't understand the divide and rule policies and how the worst people were enriched to sow division within their own countries, then you start to think, they've got a problem with democracy. They don't, they're obsessed with dictators and all that. And it's actually something that was essentially sown into them by colonial powers. Then it's easy for this bigotry to spread, which is why that colonial period is so important to understand.
Yeah, and I find it really interesting that you say, it might be more honest to talk about business deals than countries, because there was this, these private agreements between France and Britain, for example, where you mentioned in the book, countries that went to France, that France took, were Guinea, Senegal, Ivory Coast, Mali, Burkina Faso, Niger, and Benin. And then the Gambia, Sierra Leone, Ghana, Nigeria were for Britain, so to speak. That's really interesting. Then you mentioned that 30% of all African borders are straight lines, which cut through, everything in their way. And that's what you say, they divide ethnic groups sometimes, or split communities from their places of worship in some cases. And that's a recipe for disaster, really.
Yeah, if you just look at a map of the continent, you'll see the physical violence that was sown into them. You'll see these straight line borders. When you put there are really great maps that kind of show the split of the ethnic groups, and you'll see that in some cases, one ethnic group was split across about 4 different countries. Again, going back to this idea of a scramble, the colonialists didn't really know a lot about the topography of the continent. They didn't really care about all that. What they wanted to do is they wanted to sort of plant their flag and take a piece of land as quickly as they could before someone else would come in and take them. And so they put down these markers, and borders would just go straight. And in some cases, they sort of said, that river over there, that can be the border. And then now, today, you have, rivers, they move, they change shape, and so you have some border communities that one year they're part of one country, another year part of another country. You have disputes over land continually. I think about sort of 30% of all the borders in the world are in Africa, but over 60% of all the border disputes that have gone to international courts have come from the continent, because in many cases, people don't know where one country begins and one country ends. And you can imagine how fraught that is when the border runs over a piece of land that has oil underneath it, and how that has created conflict just by how badly these borders have been created. So when just looking at the map of the continent and understanding the basic geography of the region as well as the history of the region, you start to then tell the real story of this continent. You start to really break down a lot of those sort of stereotypical walls that have allowed people not to see truly what the continent is about, and instead that the reality was replaced by this idea of there's just something wrong with Africans. They don't know how to they're uncivilized, they don't know how to govern themselves, and why is there so much poverty, and why were there these civil wars in the 60s and in the 70s? When you take that history away, then it is easy to blame the local population. And so what I'm trying to do with the book and in my work is trying to reintroduce that history and the context by which this continent exists today. These are artificial countries that were created by people who did not have the continent's best interests at heart. They didn't simply just colonize already established countries and then give those countries back later on. They invented countries, invented these countries incredibly poorly, and we've inherited them. We've decided to keep them in pretty much 99% of the cases, and try to make the best of a difficult situation. And I think that countries deserve a lot of credit for doing that.
Yeah, you mentioned we decided to keep them. Of course, yeah, I mean, it's not that easy, but that was what my next question was going to be. Like, after these independence movements had come and African countries gained independence, what was it a topic of discussion at these very high tables? Like, should we redraw the borders? Should we, re-envision what these different nations should look like, and why didn't it happen? I mean, it's obviously not easy, but...
Yeah. No, it was the first conversation, essentially, that what we now know as the African Union had in the early 60s. They sort of got all the leaders of these new countries together and said, what should we do, with these borders that we've inherited and these countries that we've inherited that none of us had designed, and for a couple of reasons, but the two main reasons was that it was decided that it would just be way too complicated to undo decades and decades of what had been sown into this continent. Where do you start and then where do you end? There was a concern that a lot of these now bigger countries would have way too much influence on the smaller countries, and it would just be something that would be just way too difficult to do. And again, this is the 1960s. The rest of the world is moving on culturally and scientifically and technologically. So it's like, we could start this process, but it could. Who knows when it would end, and who knows how much more conflict could come. And they decided, okay, let's keep what we have here. And then the other issue was you had all these independence heroes who had just successfully fought for these countries, and they were first in line to get to rule these countries. And so they weren't too keen on the idea of potentially, these countries no longer existing, and who knows where that would have left them individually as well. So there were all these sort of things, but the idea was let's all try and just focus on what we've inherited. Let's make the best of a difficult situation. And it's been a hard process. But, when you understand what they inherited and you understand the challenges and the foundations of these nations, and you then start to realize that, these countries and the people across the continent deserve a huge amount more admiration than they've been given for making the best of a difficult situation.
And the situation was even more difficult, of course, because at the time the Cold War was going on as well, and just at that time when several African countries gained independence. Yeah, and that made it all the more difficult. How so?
Yeah, so you had, as I just mentioned, you had a lot of these independence heroes in many cases who had done a great job fighting for independence, but a lot of these men were certainly better suited to the battlefield than they were to actually governing a country. And so in many cases, they certainly weren't our best rulers, and they very quickly they had sort of these authoritarian tendencies in some cases. And this was happening at a time when you had the Soviet Union and the US looking around the world for allies and friends, and they were more than happy to pay for friendship, essentially. And so a lot of these early authoritarians, it became hard to get them out of government because they were literally being financed by either the US or the Soviet Union, whichever offered the most money. And, you have one case I mentioned in the book where you had one leader who literally went to the White House with a written down shopping list, essentially, of what he wanted.
Like weapons and weapons.
Yeah, it was weapons, money, all the sort of things. Literally wrote it down and handed it over, I think, to then President Jimmy Carter. And that was the dynamic. And so a lot of the challenge that the continent has had in getting rid of authoritarians have come from this dynamic of them being literally funded by Western countries and empowered by them. And that continues to happen until the Western countries turn on you. You saw it in Zimbabwe with Robert Mugabe and, a certain individual who was formerly very much a friend of the West. And then that dynamic shifted and you became an enemy to the West. And you see that in, that relationship changing when it's not convenient. Mandela was on a terror group watch list for a long time, and so was the ANC. And then suddenly, the world opened its eyes to apartheid, and the Western world pretended like, they loved him all along. You have that sort of shift in allegiances that has had a huge impact on leadership and governance across the continent.
Yeah, the same can be said about Libya's Gaddafi, of course.
Yeah.
But when you see that, and in this Cold War era, the US versus the Soviet Union, but even now and until a few years ago, but still today, how Western countries form these alliances, always out of self-interest in a way. How much trust do you have in diplomacy or in the geopolitical system at this point?
Yeah, it's a very good question, and I think the dynamic that you're seeing now, the older these African countries get, the stronger they become, and the more leverage that they then have to push back against a lot of what we've seen as sort of poor Western interactions. And I think with sort of the chaos of the political system around the world, it's becoming harder and harder for Western countries to engage with the continent the way they used to meddle, to dictate to them, to sort of say, you should be running your countries like this. You see the chaos of the political system in the US right now, and they're in a very difficult position to lecture anybody on democracy. And, you're seeing a lot of, as I said, sort of the strength of these countries growing, and you're seeing, a lot of the former French colonies right now are pushing back and saying that, they're not going to accept the previous relationship that they had with France, and they want something different. And so, now that with time and with age, as these countries get stronger and stronger, they have far better cards to play, and I think that they can hopefully use them in a way that benefits their citizens. But that is something that young people across these countries have to continue to push for.
Yeah, at some point you mention in the book, you talk about these some of the leaders who, in some cases, were independent fighters themselves, but then didn't want to give up their seat once they were leading the country. And you mentioned about Kagame from Rwanda. His reign presents a complicated conundrum about the nature of democracy and what form of governance exactly would best suit these incredibly young, forcibly divided nations grappling with their own identities. Because, of course, Kagame, the country is doing quite well, but still there are some authoritarian tendencies in Kagame's rule. So, yeah, how should they? Or how should countries, these forcibly divided young nations, be run?
Yeah, it's a really important question, and it's more and more you kind of see there isn't one way of doing it. You have to kind of look at your specific system. A lot of countries simply inherited the political system of their colonial power, and so you were sort of told that you have to have an upper house like a Senate and a lower house. And you have governors and senators and mayors and all these sort of things. And in a lot of countries, it just created too many politicians. And it didn't really make sense to local traditions. And so you kind of have to look, and I think more and more countries are kind of looking at what works individually and systems of governance that work individually for them, and what might work in a really young country that is still reckoning with your own identity and who you are and who you want to be, and your morals and your values and issues of religion. Kagame presented an interesting example because, you know, he was, or his ethnic group were essentially sort of, you know, gained power after the civil war. And so what would have normally followed would be sort of this campaign of vengeance against the other ethnic group. And he's someone who sort of essentially quelled that through this sort of strongman technique of, we simply just don't talk about it anymore.
Of the genocide.
Of the genocide, yeah. You know, we talk of the genocide. You are not to identify as your specific ethnic group. You should identify as Rwandan, and that has led to, you know, an ability to, I wouldn't say sort of move on, but not to get completely sort of lost in a cycle of vengeance and violence.
Yeah, there is this incredible anecdote in the book about Kagame meeting someone who was a member of the, of like a rebel force, or
he met a young boy as part of this sort of reconciliation effort. A lot of people who committed crimes during the Civil War were released from prison, and, you know, they're released back into society. And so I write about this young boy who ended up essentially living amongst people who had a hand in killing his entire family, and, you know, which is an incredibly difficult thing to have to do. And he meets Kagame at an event, and Kagame goes up to him and he asks him, you know, how you can be honest with me, you know, how are you coping with this? How are you managing with this, with having to live near these people? And the boy says, you know, I manage because you ask us to manage. And it's this idea of, you know, the country is coping because you have this strong leader who has said, we are going to cope. We must find a way to cope. And it's you know, economically it's doing well. They've been able to sort of move on from the challenges of the Civil War, but there's also that sort of authoritarian tendencies in humans generally tends not to end well. You know, we're not particularly good with unlimited power forever. And so you're kind of balancing those dynamics of, you know, there are people who've opposed him who have ended up dead in foreign countries. And so there's that sort of balance of, you know, what exactly is needed in these individual countries, but understanding that these young countries are having to battle the ethnic divisions that they inherited initially, to find common understanding, doing all that things while building new economic systems, educational systems, trying to harness their culture all at the same time, you know, while they're being told by the rest of the world that, you know, they're not operating as they should be, you know, often from the people who created the problems in the first place.
Another chapter in the book is about stolen art, basically. Why was it so important for you to devote an entire chapter to this phenomenon, or this thing that happened?
Yeah, so I think what's so important about this conversation about artifacts is that it is a reminder that this is another avenue in which African countries have struggled to tell their own stories. A lot of histories across the continent, a lot of their sort of identities can be told through these artifacts, and they don't have access to these items. You know, over 90% of the continent's cultural material legacy is currently being kept in museums and private collections and schools and universities outside of the continent. And the inability to be able to to tie your history with your present through these incredible things that you've made is an ongoing violence against these countries and against these communities and against these ethnic groups. It's this incredibly painful sort of siege that never ended. Often when we talk about the taking of these artifacts, we sort of describe them as something that happened a long time ago, when in fact it's something that never ended. It's one big continual theft and hoarding of these items. And it speaks to the way in which we see these countries. Often when we the justification for keeping them is, it fleets between these countries couldn't possibly look after them themselves, but how would people from the rest of the world get to experience them if they're not in Europe or in the US? And it's like, that's the point, that if these countries had these artifacts, that's even more reason for people to want to go and visit these artifacts and visit these countries and experience these countries for themselves and see just how long their legacy of craft and art and storytelling is. And so the fundamental argument at the heart of keeping these artifacts away from these countries is very similar to the dynamic of colonialism itself, and it speaks really to it. And when you hear and read about the stories of how they were taken, and then how they were kept, and and the mechanisms that continue to keep them away from these countries, you start to then see all those links to colonialism and how it's just another part of colonialism. And it's a story that really speaks to the heart of how these countries have been treated.
Yeah, and it's really exemplary for how Western countries look at African countries or at Africa as a continent. Another argument that's sometimes or often mentioned is that the context was different at the time these artifacts were stolen, but you prove, or you write in your book that that's bollocks, basically.
Yeah. In one case, you had things in the 1890s anyway, when artifacts, I think it was from Ethiopia, were taken to the UK. The then British Prime Minister William Gladstone gave a speech in Parliament saying that it was a disgrace that these items were taken. These are religious tablets, and they were taken. They were stolen from churches in the neighbouring town to where the battle took place. And in some cases, these tablets are so sacred that in the Orthodox Church, it's believed that only a handful of priests should even look at them. And they were taken in the 1890s. They were brought to London, and the Prime Minister then gave a speech saying, it's a disgrace that these items were taken. They never should have been taken. And the explorer who led the expedition sort of said, yeah, you're right, I'm sorry, we'll get these returned as quickly as possible. All of those items are still in the V&A Museum in London today. And so the idea that, the times have changed, or this is just the done thing then, doesn't add up now. It was theft then. You couldn't just go and take something, and even if it was okay then, even if that was true, which it isn't, but even if it was, that doesn't mean you keep them today. And you have these dynamics when you actually read about how these items were taken and how they ended up in museums. Often in these expeditions, which really surprised me, was that they would take curators from museums along with them, so that the army would sort of go in, do their work, and then when they were done, there was a curator waiting in the back, and they say, right, you come in, you get your first pick, the government gets to pick, and then whatever is left, soldiers can take, other institutions can take, which is why you have a lot of artifacts in private collections today. Those artifacts ended up in schools in some cases. Many of them, of course, have been lost. And so, that is something that it was very, very deliberate. It wasn't an accident. It wasn't, these items didn't just accidentally fall in someone's suitcase. It was something that was deliberate, methodical, and similar to the values of today. And they got away with it then, and they continue to get away with it today. And that is something that it's an unfortunate dynamic that I think, we should all be committed to changing.
Are these things, the things you mentioned in your book, are these things that you have worked on or have looked into for your work at Vice?
Yeah, a lot of the themes that I explore in the book, I've tried to explore at Vice. One of the things that I wanted to do at Vice was to try, and we sort of historically didn't really cover Africa as its own genre, and so a lot of kind of my own work that I tried to do was try and sort of reintroduce that idea, or introduce that idea of if we cover youth culture across the world, then we certainly should be covering the youngest region in the world, and trying to kind of do that and to show how to cover it, and we've been able to make a lot of really, really great stuff, especially around this issue of artifacts, and really work to educate people on this sort of continued hoarding of treasures from across the continent. But yeah, it's something that I'm personally really passionate about. I think it's at the heart of the work that I'm currently doing, and to a degree, a lot of the work that I'm going to continue doing into the future.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you mentioned catering to the youngest region in the world. That's also, in a way, how you end the book, or you ask the question of what is next, and you give all these really hopeful examples of change maybe coming, and hope amongst young people in various African countries. Is that the message you wanted to leave the reader with?
I think for me, when we talk about, or we think about the future, and when people sort of say, the future is going to be Africa, and its average age across the continent is about 20, or it's under 30 at least, and it's easy to just say, the future is great, it's going to be wonderful, it'll take care of itself. And I am hopeful for the future, but not just because I kind of assume that things will be fine, but because I look at what people have done across the continent up until today. I look at how much work people across the region have done to transform the countries that they inherited, through many difficult challenges, through ups and downs and all sorts of different roadblocks. I look at what they've done, and I think, if they can do all of that in 60 years, imagine what they can do in the next 60 years. And I look at a lot of the youth movements across the continent as well, and just the sort of things that young people are taking to the streets to fight for, whether it's, against police brutality, or it's in support of, LGBTQ rights, or it's in support of, or it's against violence against women. Whatever it is, you're seeing it across the continent being played out. Young people fighting for climate change, and you're seeing this sort of movement for justice and peace across the region, and then not just politically but also culturally. You look at things like Afrobeats and what a huge takeover of music that has been, and you look at the film industry and just the creativity that's come from the region, through fashion and art and music and science, across all these different things. If you look at what people have done, then there are so many reasons to think that there is a really exciting future ahead based on what people are doing. But one thing that will really accelerate that future is if the rest of the world decides to engage with the continent as it actually is. If it pushes back against these stereotypes, if it actually thinks to itself, there is this vast, diverse region that we have never been curious about previously. Let us engage with it. Let us go out there and explore all the differences across East and West Africa, and from the north to the south, and let's see what's actually there, and let's look for talent, and let's go and build businesses there, and go on holiday there, and go to cities, and yes, do safari, and all these many different things, experience it all, engage with every bit of it, then I think that we'll see a really different, accelerated future.
Yeah, let's hope so. But until then, that's how you end your book, isn't it? Let's look into the audience if there are any questions from anyone. We have a few minutes left. Yeah, I see someone up there. Please speak up.
Yes, I think the question was about China and what China is sort of doing on the continent. I think it's a really interesting example. You're seeing, I think what you're seeing, it kind of goes back to kind of what I was saying about a lot of African countries are in a sort of a stronger footing since the colonial era, certainly, and since the independence era, and are sort of making individual deals with China. I think China is certainly trying to buy relationships and buy friends and to do so in a way that they hope in the future, should they have some sort of conflict with the West economically, more likely that African countries at the very least don't pick sides in that relationship. China has spent a lot of money. It's a big bet that they've made. I'm not necessarily sure it'll pay off that well for them. Because these countries are in a different shape than they were previously. But what you're seeing sort of individual countries and in some cases individual cities making deals that in some cases will work, some won't. But the dynamic to colonialism is just very different because the physical presence isn't there. They can't militarily enforce being paid back in any way. In the future, it's an investment in relationships and hoping that the continent sort of looks towards China. I think in some cases there's lots of evidence that people have made bad deals, certainly, but then that's the responsibility of the individual leader to do what is right by their own people. But I think overall, I don't think the deals have been that great. And so, I would probably advise leaders to sort of stay away from it necessarily in a mass way, but the dynamic is sort of different to the colonialism.
More questions? Oh, yeah.
Yeah, two very good questions. So in terms of the first question, in terms of the reader, I sort of was looking for people who are incredibly curious about the region, and who there's sort of, I sort of break down as kind of the Western readers who have never had this relationship with the continent, and Black Lives Matter is happening, and perhaps they've started listening to Burner or other artists, or they're engaging in culture and they want to kind of experience a bit more. And those who work for development agencies and charities, and who hopefully are looking to sort of change their ways. And so there is that sort of hope that people who are curious about shifting the narrative, I think, and that also there are people across the continent, because again, one of the things about these young countries and them being short histories is that there hasn't been a lot of time across a lot of these countries to really sit back and think about all that they've been through in the last 60 years. In some cases, part of the sort of post-independence civil war efforts, as I mentioned, similar in Rwanda, was this sort of idea of peace and reconciliation that sort of meant we don't talk about it, which also meant you don't teach some of that history, often because a lot of the individuals who are key members of them are very much still alive, and so it was kind of awkward. So, you know, there's that that's being moved away. So there are a lot of people around the continent as well. But yeah, it's for anyone who is, I think, curious about the continent, who's open-minded, and who's mindful of the stereotypes that perhaps they've ingested, and want to go out there and change that. And then the second question around sort of the individuality versus sort of the collective, and I sort of end the book talking about Pan-Africanism. And this was also a concept that was, you know, discussed at that sort of first African Union meeting in the 1960s, where you had people like Kwame Nkrumah from Ghana, who thought, look, we have this shared, we've just gone through this shared collective experience, this violence, you know, perhaps the idea we should rejig ourselves in a way that faces the future together. And, you know, as I said earlier, a lot of these independence heroes weren't too keen on that idea. But now, as is happening around the world, when we're looking to a world without, you know, putting up unnecessary borders and stuff, there is a lot more sort of cross collaboration, especially amongst these youth movements that I was talking about, where people are saying, you know, it's been 60 years, let's share ideas of what different countries have learned. And the idea of appreciating your individual identity isn't an attempt to sort of put up borders and walls. It's instead an ability to appreciate your own specific identity and what you have to offer when like-minded people come together to face the future. So, you know, that exciting future where, you know, you're having this sort of shared cross-collaboration, and each individual country can bring to the table their own flavor and their own identity and their own history, I think is something that's really, really exciting. And that is also, of course, being shared with the diaspora, and the Black British experience, and the experience across Europe, and African Americans and Afro-Caribbeans. Like, there's a whole different dynamic across each individual one. I think there's an opportunity for the diaspora, but also anyone who's curious about engaging with the continent to get involved in.
Yeah, we have time for maybe 2 more questions, and I see one over there and one over there. Maybe first there. Mm-hmm. Yeah, so the question maybe to repeat for people in the back who maybe didn't hear, what's your view on schools and schooling system and people sometimes leaving, or in several cases leaving Nigeria to study abroad?
Yeah, across sort of, I expand the conversation, not just schools, but across the workforce as well. Brain drain is an issue across the continent, and it has been an issue. And you know, I was excited I was planning to stay, but then suddenly, you know, it got shifted up to boarding school. But yeah, brain drain is an issue, and I think that all of us across the diaspora have a responsibility to look back towards the continent and to give back in ways that we can. Ironically, my family, we run a primary school. My mum started a primary school in Lagos, and I think that is one of the most important ways of continuing to develop these young countries is through the education system. And I think that is something that's really, 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 really important. I have nephew and nieces who are going to school in Nigeria at the moment. But yeah, I think it's something when we talk about brain drain across the education system and across the workforce as well, I think I think those are things that really we need to be committed to building up and investing in, and always ensuring that we look back towards as well. And then the education system across, I do a lot of school talks as well across the UK, and I think it's so important. A lot of the biggest change that can be made will come from how we engage with the education system around the world, and ensuring that things like colonialism is taught and how these countries were created are at the forefront of our societies.
All right, there was a question here as well. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, maybe repeat the question.
Yeah, so the question is, the UK currently has a policy that they're trying to push through of sending refugees to Rwanda. And I think this is, a lot of what I've been talking about in terms of this idea of Africa being seen as a punishment. And that is something that, the British Conservative Party sort of still have those sort of attitudes of, as a deterrent, let's send people to Rwanda. It's sort of skipping the responsibility that the United Kingdom has to refugees and migrants. And in the end, it's almost like a lot of things that have happened recently involving the British government. It's unlikely to ever happen or work. Rwanda, on the other hand, have happily just kept taking money, knowing that legally this is almost certainly never. I mean, they've collected almost £300 million, and have not had to take in one refugee yet. And the UK have also built accommodation in Rwanda, and the Rwandans have happily done this. So, from Rwanda's point of view, it works pretty well for them. But I think this is a sort of another example of a certain generation completely misunderstanding the political landscape across the continent. But it's sort of this sort of and a lot of the reason why the policy exists in the first place is because the Conservative Party want to look like they're being tough on migrants and refugees, and sending them to an African country seems like a terrible thing to do, and it's purely just to sow more division across the UK, and that's sort of the unfortunate reality of the UK.
And on that happy note, no. Well, I think we're almost out of time. Dipo, I want to say thank you very much for sharing your insights. I can only advise everyone to read the book, and I have some good news, because the book will be sold, I think, here or next door in the cafe. So.